I think 10 or 11. Okay. Oh my goodness, I've got 15 minutes to do the women's suffrage movement. Who said doing a single lecture made any difference? But I will come back to this in a couple of weeks, so I'm just going to give you the rough outline here. Basically, the case for women's suffrage, the case for women's inclusion in the public world of politics was advanced in two ways. There was an argument made that women should be formally equal to men, that they were just as rational and now just as propertied, and therefore they deserve the same rights. So there's an argument for strict equality, and then there was an argument for the different qualities that women had and the different attributes that they would bring to the political system as a whole. So these two, if you like, completely different arguments being advanced to the same end. And when I've outlined both of them, I'll tell you then how women actually got the vote. And I'm going to do this actually pretty quickly. Basically, what the tradition of feminism based around the case for equality did was simply want to expand liberal political theory. Didn't want to challenge liberal theories of political representation. It just wanted to expand them to formally include women. And the argument was, as I've just suggested, that was grounded in basically two ways. One, to emphasize women's rational qualities, a tradition that really began with the work of Mary Wollstonecraft, the Vindication of the Rights of Women, that you see here, published first in 1792, but that extended through the Langham Place Circle in the 1850s and their sort of house journal, the English Women's Journal, which ran from 1858 to 1864. It's this group that pushed for exactly the reforms that I was outlining to you earlier, the push for legal and educational rights, to property, to divorce, and access to the professions. So, I think this came up last week. Women got access to Oxford and Cambridge in the 1870s. They were allowed to join the British Medical Association in the 1870s too. They weren't allowed to become members of the Law Society until 1919. And those two big acts, the Matrimonial Causes Act and the Married Women's Property Act of 1802, was absolutely part of the remit of this early group of women. At the heart of this group were the colossal figures of Harriet Taylor and J.S. Mill, okay, a husband and wife team. Okay, you're bound to have heard of J.S. Mill. You're unlikely to have heard of Harriet Taylor. But they were married. Taylor wrote The Enfranchisement of Women in 1851 and had to publish it under at the name of J.S. Mill, because otherwise she wouldn't have been able to get it published. And when Mill publishes The Subjection of Women in 1869, just after women failed to get the vote in 1867, it's basically exactly the same argument outlined by Taylor in The Subjection of Women. Okay? So what this group of women are trying to do is to push through the case for reform, the case for women to be included in the Reform Bill of 1866 and 1867 that increased the electorate for the urban men, as you'll remember from last week, I think. That fails. There's only the petition of 1866 only attracts 1,500 signatures, but it's presented by J.S. Mill, and he moves an amendment to the 1867 Reform Act to remove male persons only. Now, that doesn't work, but from 1867, unmarried women householders get the vote at local elections. Okay, there's only about 200 of them, okay, but they first symbolically get the thing, and from the 1870s, they get to vote in the school board elections as well. It's estimated, although we don't know this, no one's really done the work, that by 1900, there's about 1 million women voting at local level in this way. The big organisation that advances this constitutional case for equality and women's inclusion in the Constitution is the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, founded in 1887. This is the big, by far the biggest women's suffrage organisation. It has 100,000 members by 1914, and it is basically allied to the Liberal Party, okay, until 1912, when it finally abandoned support of the Liberal Party. And again, the strategy of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was for constitutional action, for the demonstration of the moral force of their case, but absolutely no breaking of the law, respect of law and order. A demonstration, if you like, of the moral fitness of women for the vote. The alternative is the case for difference. And this is basically represented by a sister organisation, which is a breakaway organisation, the Women's Political and Social Union, formed in 1903 by Emily Pankhurst and led by Emily Pankhurst with her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia. Now, the argument of the Women's Political and Social Union is not just that they want to be included within the Constitution, not just that they want to expand liberal theories of political representation, but they fundamentally want to change the nature of politics and change, in particularly, what they consider the masculine, illiberal nature of the state. And so this is, if you like, a return of the tradition that comes out of Josephine Butler's critique of the sort of masculine nature of state power. And to do that, basically what they do is have an increasingly radical series of actions, often described as the militant actions, where they chained themselves to railings, they conducted arson campaigns, they did attacks on public properties, and they went on hunger strikes, all of which was designed to demonstrate the liberal state's use of force against them. The liberal state's ability and willingness to use really coercive force. So their campaign was, in a sense, there to highlight the illiberal and coercive nature of a state that described itself as liberal. Now, strands of this movement, particularly Christabel Pankhurst, who wrote this fantastic book called The Great Scourge in 1913, also developed Butler's line of argument about the immorality of men as creatures of their own biology. In The Great Scourge, Pankhurst argues that 75% of men had an STD, and it was men that were destroying the racial health of the nation. So therefore, enfranchising women was necessary to protect the social purity and racial health of the nation. Only women could do that. Only women could restore, if you like, the moral sanctity of the political system. Last point to make here is that many women suffrage movements, many advocates of women's suffrage get involved in imperial social reform, in trying to reform the social conditions of women across the empire, particularly in India. So Josephine Butler, for instance, takes her campaign against the contagious diseases acts across the empire. Okay? It's argued that now that one of the ways in which women therefore make the claim for their own inclusion in the political system is by being able to demonstrate their ability to care for those other women that they didn't think ought to have the vote. So they're saying, look, we deserve the vote, but these, these Indian women, they're obviously not ready for it yet. They require us to continue to look after them. And I'll have more to say about that in a later lecture. I was going to show you a clip of a rally, but I won't. Okay. How women get the vote. 1918, the Reform Act of 1918, is the time when a lot of women get the vote, and yet it's a compromise that the suffrage movement said it would never accept. It was always a vote for all women or a vote for none of them. But in 1918, only some women get the vote. So the question is, why does that happen? Why is it that the suffrage movement accepts that compromise? At the outbreak of war, basically, the main suffrage organisations immediately suspend their campaigns in August 1914, and they get highly into what is described as patriotic citizenship, which is to say a patriotic support for the war effort, doing munitions work, doing nursing, doing lectures on food economy to try and prevent rationing, all of these types of endeavours. And the women's suffrage papers continue to be full of all of this stuff. So it would seem to be unpatriotic in the context of the war to be able to be continuing this rather divisive campaign for women's suffrage. But what happens in 1918 then is a series of things. One is that women get the vote in three different ways. They get the vote as a reward for their military service, very often as nurses on the front. Over 3,000 women qualified for this, working for the Auxiliary Army Corps or the Red Cross. They get it as members of the university franchise. Remember, I didn't know the answer to that question last week. Here's the answer. Women first get to vote as part of the university franchise in 1918. And they get them as property owners, householders, or a wife of a property holder if they were over 30. Okay, so three different categories in which they get the vote. That left about 1 million women still without the vote. And it was the 1 million women who were mainly those under 30 who had done most in terms of their war service. So it's clear that women did not get the vote simply as a reward for their activities in the First World War, because the very people risking getting their arms blown off as munitions workers are the people who don't get the vote. Rather remarkably, by 1928, the universal franchise come in, all women get the vote, and there's really very little political debate about it. Okay? The calculation is that if they'd enfranchised all women in 1918, there would have been more women voters than men, because so many men had lost their lives. And that was thought to be something that was, beyond risk. You couldn't possibly have a situation where there would be more women voters than men. As it was, when women then started to vote, they tended to vote in very conservative ways, very often for the Conservative Party with a big C, and so therefore the risk and danger of having so many women voters seemed to have receded. The point is that I'm trying to make here is it isn't the radical campaigns for women's suffrage so much as arguably the demonstration of women's nationalism in the First World War that is an important part of the way in which women get the vote in 1918. And finally, so my one revision to the